Okay. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just a quick little welcome to Monday mornings. I want to thank the Friends for sponsoring this program. This morning, we have Not Quiet on the Home Front with Barb Fecteau. Barb is the librarian at Beverly High School. She also teaches in the library media program at Salem State Library. And as we will learn today, she reads more children's literature than is probably good for her. So take it away, Barb.
Thank you. All right. So my name is Barb, and you know what? Una introduced me. I don't have to say any more about that. I am going to share a PowerPoint so that you don't have to look at my giant head for this entire presentation. So share screen, and there it is. All right, so let us start by defining history. According to me, history is what happened before I was born. So today I'm going to talk about historical fiction. And I've been hearing about books written in the 80s that have been described as historical fiction, which kind of, gets me right here. And even though these are books that, with a couple of exceptions, weren't conceived of historical fiction at the time that they were born, through the march of time, they've become so. The thread that combines them is that they all look at the home front experience of war through the eyes of young women, and they were written by women who lived through these wars. Now, when we think about war fiction, it's usually like a Johnny's got his gun kind of hopeless warfare, or the band of brothers, brave and true, testing their mettle against the war machine. But in a quick Google search of best novels about war, I found that of the top 50 that were listed, only 8 of them were written by women. Half of those were by Kristen Hanna, and only 1 of them was considered young adult. None of the ones by women were by women who had lived through the experience. There's a definite difference. Oh, come on. There we go. There's a definite distinction between the way that young men are perceived of during wartime and the way that young women are, as evidenced by these fabulous paper dolls of the era. I read a lot, and one of the things that interests me in most fiction is how writers funnel their own experiences into their work, particularly female writers of books for teenagers. I love the intersection between what really happened in the writer's experience and how they present it to their audience. Now, war is sorry, I'm having a rough time with this 2 screens business. War is a tremendous canvas for fiction. The overarching conflict brings depth to what generally just would be day-to-day stories. Most, if not all, writers bring their personal experience into their work, but in the books that we're going to look at today, these authors, who are writing specifically for young women, are taking their experiences during the war years and using them to add that young female perspective to the canvas of war literature. So first, our first war, oops, I wish to go back because I put a special picture there. Okay, our first war is the Civil War from April 12th of 1861 to April 9th of 1865. And the book that we're going to look at for this is, of course, Little Women. We all know Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. It's the first American book to show people that the lives of young women are interesting and worthy of reading about. There were other books, written for girls, but they were often, to teach them something. And books that try to teach you something, I tend to not like. I like books that teach me things by accident. Anyway, Louisa May Alcott wrote it based on the lives of her and her sisters, and we all know what happens, but I'll give you the list of spoilers just in case you're new. So it opens up when the March sisters give away their Christmas dinner. Jo writes some. They meet Laurie, their next door neighbor. Jo writes. Amy is a troll. Jo writes. Meg marries a poor man for love. Jo writes. Beth dies. Jo writes. Amy goes to Europe. Jo writes. Then Jo marries an old guy, and it ends. So if you haven't read Little Women, now you don't need to. So the book was set during the Civil War, and I think in part she did that to set it in time. She and her sisters actually were children 15 or so years before that. But part of it was to set it in time, but I honestly think that part of it might have been an excuse to get rid of the character of the father. In the book, he's a chaplain in the war, but according to Alcott herself, she said Mr. March did not go to war, but Joe did. In Little Women, the war doesn't really play much of a part outside the absence of the father and their, the poverty. But the more I read about Bronson Alcott, a man who had forward-thinking ideas about education, race, and women's rights, but he was nonetheless A-OK with living off of his wife and his daughter's writing, the more that I'm glad he was off ministering to the troops. Now, Louisa's war experience was fascinating. According to Samantha Seipel, who wrote Louisa on the Front Lines, quote, Alcott's time as an Army nurse helped her find her authentic voice and cemented her foundational belief system. Louisa, who was called Lou, which I love, she was thrilled to turn 30 in November of 1862 because it freed her up to join what they called the Sanitary Commission. This was the forerunner of the American Red Cross. Dorothea Dix, who actually had no nursing experience, but was nonetheless put in charge of the Sanitary Commission, had a list of requirements for her nurses. Besides being between the ages of 30 and 50, they must also be plain, wear brown, gray, or black clothing, and have habits of neatness, order, sobriety, and industry. So Lou decided that they were playing her song, and she joined up as soon as she possibly could. She ended up in Georgetown at the Union Hotel, which was functioning as a hospital for enlisted men. She'd read Florence Nightingale, and she was looking forward to nursing, to the actual work of nursing. She excelled at her duties, but she found that her favorite part of her job was writing letters home for the wounded soldiers who were in her care. Sadly, a few weeks into her work, she was diagnosed with typhoid pneumonia. Now, part of the treatment at that time for typhoid pneumonia was calomel, which was a poisonous mercury compound. It was widely used during the Civil War. It pretty much destroyed her health, gave her hallucinations. The cure was definitely worse than the disease, and she was brought home by her father to Concord shortly, within a month after she left. She, of course, became the very successful writer we know, but her health was never the same, and she died young at the age of 55. Now, she fictionalized her wartime experiences in the book Hospital Sketches, and she helped promote the idea of female nurses for the military. Lou once stated in reference to the marriage of her older sister, I'd rather be a free spinster and paddle my own canoe. And she very much paddled that canoe. The war offered her independence in a way that she had not even imagined. And even though her time there was brief, she illustrated the lives of her little women as independent and nearly outside the traditional male dominant realm. We are even able, due to her storytelling gifts, to forgive Amy for marrying Laurie. And if you don't get that joke, I don't know what you're doing here because Amy and Laurie, don't get me started. All right, now we are on to World War I, the war to end all wars. This went from July 18th, 1914, that was in Europe and Canada. The US jumped in April 6th, 1917, and it all ended November 11th, 1918. You all know this war. An Archduke was assassinated, and the next thing you know, we have trench warfare and the sinking of the Lusitania. Everything I know about this war, I learned from Downton Abbey and these three books I'm going to talk about here. The first one is All of a Kind Family by Sidney Taylor. So Sidney Taylor was born Sarah Brenner, and she was 9 when the war began. She was 12 when the US entered. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I'm at school. So if you're attending this talk from Beverly High School, it's time to change class. She was a young Jewish girl growing up in New York City, and she went on to immortalize the lives of her and her sisters through the All of a Kind family books. There's recently been a resurgence of interest in her books. In the past few years, they've been republished by Lizzie Skurnick Press. An academic biography from Sarah to Sydney was recently published, and but her work has been influential for years. In 1968, the Association of Jewish Libraries created a book award to be presented annually to outstanding books for children and teens that authentically portray the Jewish experience, and they named it in honor of Sidney Taylor. So there are 5 books in the series that start when Sarah was 8. And there's very little of the war in the books. There's nothing of the war in the books before the US entered it, which surprised me because Taylor's family emigrated from Germany. And I'm sure that it must have been a topic of conversation in her home. But when All of a Kind Family Uptown begins, it's on, and Mama is at the Red Cross helping out. And the oldest sister, Ella's boyfriend, Jules, is getting ready to sign up. So in these books, it seems to a degree that the war is used as a plot device. Taylor is a genius of taking small things that happen in the family's life, like learning how to dust the living room, forgetting train fare, staining a dress, and she makes delightful stories out of them. She barely needs the vast drama of the war, and yet she uses it to show how it affects the lives of these girls. It doesn't permeate everything, but it sets the story in time, and it really gives a shot in the arm to the quiet sweetness of the love affair between eldest sister Ella and her boyfriend Jules, which frankly would be kind of a snooze without the war because they're just nice and they love each other, and that's the whole thing. So what it does, it comes down to this. Jules tells Ella that he's signing up, and all of a sudden the war is of paramount importance to her. She's knitting stuff, she's sending packages, she sets up her best friend Grace with one of his buddies when they're home on leave before shipping out to Europe. In this scene, one of my favorites, the two couples are out on the town singing at the top of a double-decker bus. And this is the night before Jules and can't remember the buddy's name, before they're shipping out. And it's on the cover of the book, and it stuck with me since I read it in the 70s. It's an illustration of how you can still find the joy in life in the midst of uncertainty. So the book goes on. There's a missing person scare. Jules is lost for a while, but he comes back. Everything is well. And there is a little bit of sort of, realism here. The Victory Arch at Madison Square Garden, which is this beautiful, enormous arch that there was a huge parade through. It was constructed hastily of wood and plaster and was located at the intersection of Fifth Avenue and Broadway. It only stood there for 2 years, but it's immortalized here. So while Taylor lived through the war and certainly shows the day-to-day lives of her characters in that time, feels a little bit more like a plot construct rather than an intrinsic piece, probably due to the fact that she was so young. It was just her early teens when she went through the war. Now, next up, we're going to look at Betsy and the Great World and Betsy's Wedding. So Maud Lovelace, the author of these books, was 22 when the war began and 25 when the US entered. And she was actually living in Europe when the war started. It had a huge impact on her life in that she had to cut her travel short, and also that she met the love of her life because of the war. But we're going to back up a little bit. So what you need to know is that Maud Lovelace wrote the best series of books ever, the Betsy Tacy books. They are my all-time favorite. They're set in Mankato and Minneapolis, Minnesota for the most part, other than Betsy and the Great World, which is set in Europe. And they're set at the turn of the 20th century, and they're very closely based on Maud's life. They're mostly about friendship and what it's like to grow up in the Midwest at this time. But they also have a real feminist bent. Betsy wants to be a writer, and her family is cool with that. And they trust her instincts, and they give her sort of the confidence to do that. So they start when Betsy's turning 5, the books, and she meets her best friend Tacy, and they continue as the girls grow up, attend high school, and then they end with these two, Betsy and the Great World and Betsy's Wedding. Those last two contain a lot of information about the buildup to World War I. So in January of 1914, Betsy left college after 2 years. She had split up with her high school boyfriend, Joe, and she's been acting the fool at college, not taking it seriously. So after a trip to California, her parents, who were, upper middle class Minnesotans, offered to send her to Europe. There's Betsy going, there's Maud going. Since Betsy's already sending stories out to magazines for publication, as was Maud, and had some small success, she can see the world and gather material. It's going to be an educational trip. So she leaves the States in January. She spends a couple months in Munich. She travels around for a while, then heads to Venice, then France, and she's in England in August when the war is declared. Now in Munich, she mentions several times how many soldiers she sees and how everyone defers to them. She also comments on the economy, and there's a lot of foreshadowing that something is definitely going on. When war is declared, Betsy has to bust out of England and get home, and at the advice of a writer who she spent time with one day in Paris, she checks out the agony column in the London Times. Now, it turns out that her former sweetheart, Joe, has left her a message in the paper, and it says, "The Great War is on, but I hope ours is over. Please come home." So in the book, Betsy's Wedding, she does. And they have their first year of marriage before the war. But the thrum of the war underneath all of the other threads of the story is palpable. The Willards and their friends sing war songs during their parties. The younger brother of a main character is desperate to go up to Canada to sign up. Betsy sees it coming. And the scene after the US finally does join the war and her husband Joe quits his job to go to officers candidate school is shown as a heartbreaking parallel to Betsy's grandmother's story that she had told her about how her grandfather carried his books home from the schoolhouse when he joined the Union Army at the start of the Civil War. And there's a quote from the book, "War," Betsy thought, holding back her own tears with all the force of her stubborn will. "War, women never invented it." Well, Maud's real life experience was the same to Betsy's in many ways. In the letters that Maud wrote home when she was traveling at this time, from which she wrote the story, she mentions how many soldiers are on the street, how they act entitled at the pension where she's staying. And in the book, she sells it hard. Clearly, there is some foreshadowing about the war. So at the end of Great World, she sailed for home from London. Hold on, I can't read my own writing. She sailed for home from London after war was declared, and the descriptions of other travelers attempting to leave England is gripping. There's an entire chapter about her trying to get a berth on a boat, and it's something. So the biggest difference in the books, most notably in Betsy's Wedding, is that in real life, Maud didn't meet her husband until the US entered the war in the spring of 1917. Maud was hired to fill a position writing for a publicity bureau when her husband, DeLoss, who was a newspaper man, he left to go to officers training at Fort Snelling. So Lillian Wakefield, who you can see in the illustration is fictionalized, she was the wife of the publisher of the Minneapolis Tribune, and she fixed them up. And they were married 7 months later before Joe went overseas. And this picture is actually the real dining room where they met for the first time. And so I think that Maud probably stuck that in there as a little Valentine to her husband. So in real life, Maud's marriage, which lasted for 50 years until DeLoss's death, was an outgrowth of the war. And the book ends with a military wedding of a friend back in their hometown of Deep Valley. And it also ends with the unknown. Will Joe come back? Spoiler, DeLoss did. So for Maud, the world cut short the adventure of a lifetime, but in return, it gave her the love of her life. So Great World and Betsy's Wedding show the slow boil of the war, both in Europe and later in the States, through Betsy's eyes, which are just like Maud's. All right, the next book that we're going to look at is Rilla of Ingleside. You have surely heard of the Anne of Green Gables books. They constitute a series that has been beloved since the first book was published in 1908. They've never been out of print since then, and they've been made into several television series that people feel tremendously loyal to. The most recent iteration was in 2017, Anne with an E. I have to say it holds up, but I have some other friends who would get in a knife fight with me because they hate Anne with an E so much because it's not one of the other series. People get riled about Anne, so just be careful what you say. So the books tell this, if you don't know, the books tell the story of Anne Shirley, who's an orphan who's taken to live with the Cuthberts, a brother and a sister who live on Prince Edward Island. They were hoping for a boy to be sent from the orphan asylum to help out because Matthew, the brother, isn't getting any younger, and they're conflicted about keeping Anne. But her good heart wins them over, even as her overactive imagination makes them bonkers. But this imagination is what brings spark to the book that's made it a treasured classic. Anne grows up in Anne of Avonlea, matures a little bit. She goes to college in Anne of the Island. She gets married in Anne's House of Dreams. She has some kids in Rainbow Valley and finally experiences the war in Rilla of Ingleside. However, the book focuses on her youngest child, Rilla, rather than Anne herself. There are a couple of other books in the series that I have not read because they were shoved into the narrative in the 30s. So how important could they be? I'll get to them someday. So Lucy Maud Montgomery was 39 years old when the war started, and she was obsessed with the war. The annotated Rilla of Ingleside, which is terrific. The editor, Jen Rubio, says that she watched the progress of the war vigilantly, if not obsessively, and it's definitely clear from her journals. So she had a stillborn child on August 13th, right as the war was beginning, and she was not in a good place. Now, she did have a toddler to take care of, which helped her, sort of come back from that tragedy. And she kept detailed, fascinating journals. Her journal entries with what the baby was doing and what the Serbians were doing, like, one sentence after the other. The war is so enmeshed with her life. Other than Louisa May Alcott, Montgomery is definitely the most studied of the writers that we're looking at, perhaps even more so than Alcott. Her selected journals were published in the 80s and 90s, but her complete journals were made available. Were made available in the last 10 or so years. and they are fascinating. They're full of details about the war and her personal life. And, you know, she was writing them for herself, not for posterity. And so she is brutally honest, and they're amazing. So because of the success of the Anne of Green Gables books, which this is the last, Rilla has been published and reprinted numerous times, and many of these covers are ridiculous. If you can see the one in the lower left-hand corner, Rilla would never have shown her shoulders in public. This is a shocking state of affairs. But, you know, this book has held up. The University of Prince Edward Island had a conference in the summer of 2014 to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the war. And they entitled it L.M. Montgomery and the War, which was very Rilla heavy. So it was written just 2 years after the Great War and is considered the best depiction of the home front in Canada during that war. According to Rubio, it's, quote, a female version of the war myth. The traditional war myth concerns the sacrifices of a generation of young men for a better world. In Rilla, Montgomery describes the sacrifices of women. So it's a story of a young girl, Rilla's 14 at the beginning, and she's lovely. She's very pretty. She's a little bit vain. She's kind of shallow. But when the war hits and her brothers and friends are, you know, being called overseas, she steps up. At first, she organizes the Junior Red Cross, which leads to the discovery of a motherless baby whose father is overseas. Rilla ends up incompetently, yet wholeheartedly, taking over the care of the baby, who she doesn't like. She doesn't like babies, but when she first gets him, like the whole next 3 chapters are her like complaining about what a little turd he is. And then, of course, she ends up falling in love with him. There's a bit of a love story, which I'm sure would have been very compelling to me if I had read this as a young woman, but I just read it for the first time recently. She becomes the foster mother for that baby. Her fears for her loved ones, the antics of those around her, including a housekeeper who becomes obsessed with the war news, a neighbor who's a virulent pacifist, and a dog who waits at the train station for years for his master to return, make this a fascinating look at the Canadian home front. Here, I'm going to give you another set of covers to look at. So reading Rilla. Oh, and actually, I did not read Rilla. I listened to Rilla. The audiobook of it was on Hoopla. Just want to do a quick little ad for Hoopla here, which you can get for free from the Beverly Public Library. And all of the Anne of Green Gables books are available on audio in a couple of different versions. Anyway, so listening to that while reading Montgomery's journals was fascinating. Even though she was much older than the character, she imbues Rilla with the same spirit. Rilla's journal entries are very similar to Montgomery's, and the character of Susan, who's the housekeeper, is clearly parroting Montgomery's own feelings of the war played out. There's a continuing motif in Montgomery's work about the Pied Piper playing boys off to war, which sort of finds its end point here. And there are losses, the most heartbreaking of which is the loss of Walter, Rilla's dearest brother, who was afraid to go to war, but finally did. In the last letter he sends her, he says, quote, I shall never be afraid of anything again, not of death nor of life, if after all I am to go on living. And life, I think, would be the harder of the two to face, for it could never be beautiful for me again. There would always be such horrible things to remember, things that would make life ugly and painful always for me. I could never forget them. It's just so gut-wrenching. Rilla of Ingleside is a war novel, at sometimes masquerading as a young adult historical romance, but it's far more than that. It's a detailed study of rural Canadian life during the First World War, written by a woman who lived through it and distilled it all with her trademark creative emotion in a gem of a novel. Through it, readers worldwide were able to encounter a narrative that made a young woman's voice an equal and vibrant part of the cultural history of the war. It's my belief that Rilla offered Montgomery a chance to make sense of the war, to take her trauma and turn it into something beautiful. It offers patriotism and glory, but it still recognizes that war is hell for everyone involved. All right, our next war is World War II. Okay, we're going to be looking at the work of Janet Lambert in this section, and you may not have heard of Janet Lambert. Janet Lambert's kind of a deep dive, unless you are a complete mid-20th century YA nerd. She was born Maud Janet Doty Snyder, December 12th or December 17th, 1893, in or around Crawfordsville, Indiana. She graduated from Crawfordsville High School and moved to the big city to be an actress. She appeared in traveling plays as well as on Broadway, but she eventually returned home and married a local boy, Kent Craig Lambert, on January 1st, 1918. So she, like Maud Hart Lovelace, was a war bride. Now, Kent was a career military man. He started out as a cavalry officer in World War I, and he also saw service in North Africa and Anzio during World War II. Lambert published 54 books between 1941 and 1969. Very prolific, 2 books a year. She was considered a literary lightweight in her time, and even by now, by the few that remember her, but her stories are grippy. Her families are ridiculously happy. And according to a woman who's quoted in an article, one of the 2 academic articles I was able to find about her, this woman, Coleman, says, "I loved and still do love Lambert's attentiveness to history and context. Open a lot of other books of that era and you could be in any Mick world. But if you open up Janet Lambert, you know that she understands how 1946 is different from 1950, which is actually a really, I thought that was a really great catch because it's true. And I think it might be because of how fast she wrote. You know, she wrote so fast that her books really are set in time. So in the Tippy Parish books, which we're going to discuss later, Lambert adeptly illustrates, and this is another quote from the Thompson article, the rebuilding of Germany after World War II, the beginning of the Cold War, the invasion of South Korea. Each book was published not long after the events described. Lambert's husband and son-in-law were Army men, and patriotism is never far from the surface. In these books, even when there's no actual war, the Cold War is a given. Every aspect of the military and military life is treated almost worshipfully. The necessity of fighting when called to do so is assumed. So from my perspective, in the world of Janet Lambert, the backdrop of war served as an opportunity to serve and be selfless, but it also showed the depth of both opportunity and loss, particularly for young women. Her work is also a treasure trove of propaganda. And so I introduce you to Miss Candy Kane. It's a terrible name, but oh well. So the story is that Candy is the daughter of a successful businessman who's an Army reservist who gets called up to active duty in the early days of World War II. Her mother is a trophy wife of epic proportion, and her older sister Lee is a shallow socialite. So Candy and her dad moved to Georgia to a military post that he'll be working at, while the mom, who's never called mom, but rather Marcia, because she is a very, very cold so-and-so who's obsessed with her beauty, can't bear to be thought of as motherly. And the sister Lee, the less said about her, the better. They stay home and close up the apartment and the farm. It's rather well-to-do. So Candy, when they get to the base, she's on her own a lot, and she ends up meeting the family next door. So there's warm, loving mom who actually says, "Call me mom." So she gets to call somebody mom for the first time. And she shows Candy what good parenting looked like. And then mom has a son named Barton, who's a whining mansplainer. He will come up later. So Candy meets a soldier with whom she shares no romantic interest. She's little, she's like 14 in this, but she fixes up the soldier with the pure of heart Jane. Well, her sister Lee finds out that Corp, the soldier, is very rich, and she tries to steal him away, but good sense and true love prevail, and Candy ends up singing in a talent show, and in the process learns how to be more grown up, which means caring about her clothes and brushing her hair. One of the reasons that Candy Kane really grabbed me is because the emotional abuse that Candy suffers from her mom is real. Like, there's not a lot of love there. It's just nagging and fear. I honestly don't know if Lambert was aware how vicious Marcia is to her daughter, like how awful that looks, at least to the modern eye. It's a bit too easy how quickly Marcia begins to appreciate Candy when Candy becomes more feminine and shows a talent for singing. It's really Candy's kindness that makes her worthy of having a book named after her. She is a selfless wonder, always thinking of others. So the second book in her arc is Woe Matilda, and I'm just going to end the suspense here and tell you that Matilda is Barton's car. You can see it in the picture there. So we have a little time jump. Candy is now a senior in high school, and she's living in the DC area with her parents. Her dad is doing importantly manly war work. Her mom is volunteering like a crazy person. Lee has married an officer and is living in California. Well, it turns out Lieutenant Colonel Kane, Candy's dad, is headed for North Africa along with Lee's husband, Ann Coop, and the young officer that Candy fixed up with Jane in the previous book. So it turns out Barton comes to Washington. He'd been in West Point. He decided to leave to become a flyer. So the ladies end up moving down to the Fort Benning area, which is where Barton is conveniently stationed. And he stores his rust bucket of a car, Matilda, with them at Jane's ancestral home. Jane has a baby who's cute, not annoying. So the story concerns itself with Candy and Barton's nascent love affair, and with Lee becoming less of a beast and starting to do for others. Candy is really good at singing God Bless America. And when she sings it, America opens their pockets and gives money to war bonds. So she is invited to Florida to go on a bond rally and sing. Barton ends up stalking her down there for a while. But what's really interesting about this is the way that the story, whatever, a car, okay, but it's the sort of the propaganda pieces that come in. So at the beginning of the book, Marcia freaks out when her husband is called up to go overseas. She's a basket case, and it's a really interesting comparison with the Parishes, who are another family in this series. All of this, she has a bunch of different families, Janet Lambert, and they're all like interrelated. It's like I'll talk more about it in a minute. But the Parishes, when the father's called up, the mom's like, okay, stiff upper lip, talk to you soon. And there's this definite underlying thing of Janet saying, now, ladies, when your man is called up to war, make sure that you are supportive and calm and don't give him anything to worry about. There are interesting details to set the time. That when the troops are landing in French Morocco, there's gas rationing taking place in Alabama, but not in Georgia. There's also a subplot about food shortages starting, and Candy wishes for, quote, rationing and a fair distribution of food. It's a nice little bit of wartime propaganda that sets it up from a teenage girl's perspective. And the bottom line is basically, if you buy from the black market, you're a commie and you hate America. So in this book during Christmas, the Kane women and Jane have some random soldiers over to celebrate. And this allows them to bring up the idea of wives and the need for women doing war work, but also the need for childcare so that they can, go off and do this work. And Lee ends up, she's usually horrible, but she ends up starting a nursery to help these women out. So Corp, the soldier Candy fixed up in her eponymous book, ends up losing a foot in North Africa. And there's the story, the trajectory of his wife waiting back home to find out what impact that will have on their lives is fascinating. So what we get from this book is that war changes people, usually for the better if you don't count a missing foot, and that Candy is the girl that makes the world go round, and that Barton is still a mean baby dud. So the third book in this series is One for the Money, which was published in 1947, and it's mostly about horse racing, but there are some nice post-war revelations. The Canes are now living in California, and Candy's sister and her husband are having a hard time living together now that he's back, that whole, bringing the family back together. And also Barton fought in the Pacific, and he really doesn't want to talk about it. I mean, he's never great. It's kind of amazing, actually, that Lambert, she tends to sugarcoat her male characters and keep them kind of paper thin, but Barton feels very real if flawed. Those two characters don't have any more books of their own, but they do show up in one of the Tippy Parish books later. She's still wonderful. He's still dealing with his complex personality. So seeing the trajectory of the war through a teenage girl's eyes negates the military drama, but it amps up the real life experience on the home front in ways that I am not entirely sure that Lambert intended, but that she delivers on beautifully. So next up is Korea. This is the Korean conflict went from June 25th, 1950 to July 27th, 1953. These are Dick and Lil Fecteau during the Korean conflict. They are my in-laws. So Dick was a soldier, he was there, and then Lil was a teenager. They weren't going together during the war. They knew each other in school, but my mother-in-law thought he was snobby, so she wouldn't date him until he came back. So this is the war that I have the strongest connection to because my father-in-law served, and I've heard his stories, but it seems to be the one that history tends to gloss over. It was fairly brief. The show MASH, which was set in Korea, lasted 11 years, which is 3 times longer than the war itself. And yet in my family, it looms large. And Janet Lambert gives this war its due in her writing. So she was 57 when the war started. She was definitely not having a teenage girl experience. She was living on Governor's Island, where her husband was the commander of Fort Jay. Well, he retired in 1951. They moved to New Jersey, where they retired, but she did not retire because she continued to write 2 books a year for like the next 18 years. But her characters stayed in the military. So this is this arc is the Tippy Parish arc. Now the Parishes show up in a bunch of her books, and they're peripheral characters and others. It's basically, so Tippy is the younger daughter of Colonel Parish, who's a career military man. They live on Governor's Island until Little Miss Atlas. And Little Miss Atlas, they moved to Germany to help with rebuilding under the Marshall Plan. Janet Lambert loves the Marshall Plan. So in Germany, Tippy becomes reacquainted with Ken Parrish. He's a friend of her older sisters from a previous book. He's 22 and she's 16. So it's a little icky, but it's not really romantic. He's a good friend to her. He provides a lot of exposition about the importance of America being seen as a beacon of wonderfulness in the world. And he keeps her company when she's very lonely, away from America. So in Miss America, the second book of this arc, Tippy comes back to the States and has a bit of a romance with Peter, who's a character from yet another Lambert series. Seriously, it's a spider web of reoccurring characters in her books. But Ken Prescott, he's still there in the back of her mind. He had a talk with Mr. Parrish back in Germany at the end of Little Miss Atlas, and where he said that he had feelings for Tippy, but he knew she was too young, so he was stepping back. But now he's headed for Korea, and Tippy is 18 to his 24, so everything's fine. It was a different time. It was fine for back then. In the next book, Don't Cry, Little Girl, they are full on in love. Lambert allows Tippy to imagine a life without Ken going to war. Quote, Tippy isn't allowed many rebellious feelings that might stand in the way of our belief in the soldier's need to do his duty. That's from the Thompson article. But we do hear Tippy's inner voice reflect on the unfairness of it. In Miss America, Tippy thinks, women will see that peace is kept. The Russian women love their children, the North Koreans, the Germans, Americans, British, French, women all alike the world over. We must have more of them in politics. That is the way to stop war. Now, this is a real departure for Lambert, who mostly contrives heroines who put the love of a good man above anything other than God and America. And it plays out in the arc of Ken and Tippy's love affair. So after a whirlwind meeting in New York City, heavily chaperoned by Tippy's parents, Ken is off to war, and I hate to tell you this, but he never comes back. Now, earlier in the story about Tippy's older sister, different series of books, there's a friend who's killed in World War II, but he's a very peripheral character to whom we haven't grown attached. In this one, the reader loves Ken. He is awesome, and it's a gut punch. I found a quote in my notes for this presentation that says, quote, Tippy allows Lambert the lens of a young woman who is deeply in love and then smashes it to the ground. Lambert is very pro-military, but in this story, she finally, after 18 books, shows that loss is an outgrowth of war. And I'm a little embarrassed. I can't find out the attribution for that. I may have written myself, but I don't remember, and it sounds frankly better than I would do. But it's pretty sharp observation. At any rate, this is a big step for Lambert, and I have to wonder if this is because her husband was out of the military when she wrote this, so she felt more able to show the darker side. There is much talk of the dangers of communism, but like the actual Korean War, the impact on American society is far less than on the individuals who are tied to it by family members serving in it. After Ken's death, Tippy has a rough go, like all of Rainbow, second half of Don't Cry, Little Girl, and Rainbow After Rain. They're kind of soul crushing. She even tries working in television, but ultimately she ends up marrying that earlier crush, Peter, from Miss America. But her journey from giddy, love-struck girl to a heartbroken young woman is poignant, and it's a fitting testament to the many, many women who had to wait at home only to hear the worst. All right. Our last war that we will be discussing is Vietnam. It ran from March 8th, 1965 to April 30th, 1975. The Vietnam War predates me by 8 months and 2 days, but as you can see from this picture, I was clearly not in any condition to pay attention to it. I remember hearing about the war, but the only thing that really made an impact was the Kent State massacre, because my favorite babysitter, Nancy, was a student who was there that day, and my parents were worried about her. Had I been 10 to 15 years older, I imagine it would have been a whole different story. So the book that I want to look at for this era is The First Few Friends by Marilyn Singer. Now, my senior year of high school, I found this book. It was written in 1981. And it's a story of a girl who comes back from her junior year abroad in college in England to find that the world that she lives in has changed. Her friends, who were like a nerdy bunch of students, are now caught up in sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And her college classmates are involved in the fight to end the war, as well as the fight for racial justice. So the story concerns Nina's exploration of all of these different issues. This book made me desperate to go to college in the late 1960s and live in it. I read and reread this book over and over. So when Facebook came around, I was thrilled to see that the author, Marilyn Singer, and I had some mutual friends. I was a bit of a Facebook stalker. If she would post on one of our friends' whatever, I would like post underneath just so that our names were on the same thing. Such a nerd. Anyway, when I decided to give this talk, I finally got up the guts to reach out to her to ask her if I could talk to her about this book that had such an impact on me. Look at how happy we are. It ended up being one of the most fun hours of my life. At the end of our talk, she told me to let her know when I was coming to New York City so that we could get together. And I yelled, "I could be there in 5 hours." To her credit, she laughed rather than looking concerned, but I will be visiting her this summer. So if you don't know Marilyn Singer, she has had over 100 of her books published. She's very prolific. She writes mostly picture books and poetry. A handful of them are YA. I think her YA is terrific, but she's been much more successful in these other areas. And The First Few Friends is my favorite of her young adult. So when I got to interview her, she assured me that a lot of what happened in this book was absolutely true. She was 16. Marilyn was 16 when the war began, and she based the book on her own life. And the character of Nina is 19 when the story begins. Now, according to Marilyn, nearly all of the characters are based on real people. The band was real, her girlfriends were real, her friend who was drafted into Vietnam was real, even her skeezy Welsh poet boyfriend in England and the lousy bass player boyfriend when she got back, she had a lot of boyfriends, are real. So in the book, Nina starts out as an observer. She's been overseas for a year. She comes back and everything's changed. There's all this political unrest. And then she gets pulled in as she changes up her priorities and gets involved. The character of Floyd, who is a college friend who's sent to prison as an agitator for demonstrating for Black history courses at the college, he talks to Nina about the need for representation in education in a way that we are still talking about it 40 years later. When Nina starts her student teaching under a very traditional English teacher, she tries to integrate some forward-thinking methods in her classroom, which causes trouble with her supervisor, but leads to friendship with a fellow teacher. The culmination of the book is when Nina makes a break from her toxic friendships from before her trip and becomes involved in the anti-war protests. Her friend Billy, a dancer who's been drafted and is seriously injured, comes home. Floyd is released from prison. Along with her teacher friend Ruth, they constitute the first new friends of Nina's adult life. And what stands out to me in this book is the way that Nina is pulled into the tide of the anti-war movement as if it was inevitable. As Marilyn Singer said in our interview, you would have had, quote, "You would have to have been really non-political not to have gotten swept up in some of the protests." Really, it was obvious that this was a bad path that our country was going on. She attended, Marilyn herself attended local protests in New York as well as a march in Washington, and she continues to be politically active today. This book feels as vibrant today as it did when I first read it 40 years ago. And I actually have an extra copy because she sent me 2 copies. So if anyone would like to read it, just put your info in the chat and we can do like a round robin. It's out of print. Otherwise, I would say just go buy it. All right. So through these books, we see many ways that wars fought far away had an impact on young women. In Little Women, it was mostly the privation that came from the absence of Joe's father, who, let's face it, wasn't much of a provider anyway. In All of a Kind Family Uptown, it was the villain standing in the way of Ella and Jules's young love. In Betsy and the Great World and Betsy's Wedding, it was the ominous undercurrent threatened to upend Betsy's adventure and then her new marriage. And in Rilla, it was that awful Pied Piper stealing the brothers and friends and forcing Rilla to take on far more responsibility than anyone thought she was capable of. For Candy Cane, the war actually gave her opportunities to show her strength and help her horrible, horrible family become better people. In Don't Cry, Little Girl, the war destroyed Tippy's dreams for the future. And finally, in The First Few Friends, the war taught Nina that she has a voice and that she could take steps to change the world. So these aren't the stories of firefights and wounds and brotherhood, but rather young women facing the crucible of war in their own individual way and coming out stronger. And in spite of being fiction, they all have the seed of truth that's made possible by the real experience of the women who wrote them.